Once again, we're very fortunate to have Leith Van Onselen, who's the Chief Economist at MB Fund and MB Super, joining us for his Treasury of Common Sense. And as we discussed earlier with Dennis Shanahan, there's been a lot of talk around the cost of living this week, which is a welcome change, although the news isn't that great. G'day, Leith. Thanks for joining us, mate.
G'day, Bill. Thanks for having me on.
Now, the ABS, second quarter wage growth data, that is interesting when you factor it in with all the other stuff we're going through.
Yeah, it was another bad result, unfortunately, Bill. So Australia's wages in the June quarter grew by 0.8%, and that was below the 1% growth in inflation, which meant that we went backwards. Unfortunately, our Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, spanned the result as a positive. So he said that nominal wages have hit 4 from 4. That's a quote from Jim Chalmers, which meant that wages have grown by at least 4% for the past 4 quarters, which he said has, quote, never happened under the Liberals. But the reality is that's only if you look at, wages in nominal terms, then you don't take out inflation. And once you actually strip out inflation, Australian real wages have fallen for 2 consecutive quarters, and they're actually down by 7.2% below their June 2020 peak. So they're tracking basically at 2010 levels.
So is that the meaning of the term real wages, Leith? Am I mistaken? Because that's what it's supposed to mean, isn't it, when you strip out things like inflation?
That's right, yeah. So real wages is actually your purchasing power after inflation, and our purchasing power is back at 2010 levels. So we've effectively given up 14 years of wage gains, and it's even worse than that, Bill, because real wages is measured against headline CPI inflation, which is just the way the ABS measures inflation. But the ABS also has a separate cost of living indices, which are released a week earlier. And that breaks down cost of living amongst different types of households. And the one that's most important for 2/3 of Australians at least is employee households. So that's basically households that are headed by someone who works, which is most of us. And the cost of living for employee households actually rose by 6.2% in the year to June, which means that if we've got, wage growth of 4.1% and employee cost of living's gone up by 6.2%, that means that households have gone backwards even further than what the, official inflation data says. So it's not really something that Jim Chalmers should be crowing about, I wouldn't have thought.
And again, I keep coming back to this point, and I know it's oversimplifying a rather complex set of circumstances, but there's more than one way to skin a cat, and governments keep talking about putting more money in our pockets. What about actually working on regulatory and legislative matters to keep the cost of living down? Isn't that a possibility as well?
Yeah, it is. It is. And look, I bang on about it most weeks, but we have essentially engineered an energy crisis in this country whereby we pay, some of the highest gas and electricity prices in the world, because despite the fact that we're swimming in gas and we're swimming in coal and all this sort of stuff, we've managed to engineer a situation whereby we pay really high prices. And that's really due to government failure, let's be honest. So, we export over 70% of our gas on the East Coast. We don't reserve any for domestic use, which means that our prices are extremely high, and then that pushes up electricity prices because we use gas to generate electricity. And as a result, Australians, despite the fact that we're one of the world's biggest exporters and we should have incredibly cheap energy, we actually have very expensive energy. And that's just one of the ways in which the cost of living and inflation is driven up, and then that leaves you with less money in your pocket. And you can also look at, say, the rental market. So obviously the federal government's running a huge immigration program. Well, that's, the population growth's growing a lot faster than we can build houses, and as a result, we've got really high rental growth. And then that's also obviously adds to the cost of living and reduces disposable income. So there's a whole bunch of things the government could be doing to improve the situation, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have it on the to-do list.
And we had a text earlier. I know this is sidetracking a little bit, but we had a text earlier from someone quite rightly pointing out that this constant harping about RBA and the interest rates, it's only referring to 1/3 of the population because they're the only people that have got mortgages, but they completely disregard all the business loans out there. And
that's right. Yeah.
And I know business loans and mortgages are run differently by the banks. We understand that, but even your investment loan is a different loan to your home ownership, your residential loan, so to speak. So there are differences there, but fundamentally, the interest rates rises affect all kinds of loans.
That's right. Yeah, basically across the board. So if you have high interest rates, it's going to impact businesses, households, etc. And obviously, we've got a situation whereby a lot of central banks around the world are now cutting interest rates. So Canada's cut them a couple of times, the Bank of England's cut, and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand actually cut their rates this week. And unfortunately, it looks like Australia's going to have to wait longer. And part of that's because, and one of the reasons, which was cited this week by RBA Governor Michelle Bullock, is that Australia has high energy costs. And she actually singled that out as one of the things. And the reason why we have high energy costs is because we've got government failure. So, and these high energy costs are feeding into construction inflation, for example. And, for example, if you're a brickworks and you make bricks, if you're paying high gas prices, which they are because we don't have domestic gas reservation, then that feeds into the cost of building, which makes it harder to solve the housing crisis. So it's just one of the areas whereby Australia's lagging in a lot of other countries around the world, and we've unfortunately turned energy in from a competitive advantage. It should be a comparative advantage for this country. It should be one of the reasons why we're ahead. We're actually behind because of engineered incredibly high prices, which is just silly.
And look, notwithstanding the points I made earlier about costs of living and more than one way to handle things other than just putting more money in our pockets, real wage growth is necessary, obviously, and that's something that has been falsified over, what you reckon, about a decade now?
Yeah, well, I mean, not really falsified. It's just that the standard way you measure it is you basically take nominal wage growth and you take out inflation. That's the way you deflate everything into real terms. But it's a little bit more detailed than that. If you actually look at it against the cost of living indices, which is the other measure the ABS does, and then you break it down by employee households. It's just that since the RBA started raising rates, that has pushed up the cost of living significantly more than inflation. That's because of mortgage costs. That's the main reason. And but there have been other periods when interest rates have come down whereby cost of living has increased by less than inflation. But that was a long time ago. So the situation that we've got at the moment is, at least since the RBA started hiking rates, the cost of living has risen a lot faster than inflation for, employee households. And then that actually makes the whole real wage argument even worse.
Now, interestingly, we just had a text come in from Jordan, which I think brings us to the point you wanted to make next, mate, and that's regarding immigration. And his text says, politicians continually ignore the elephant in the room, which is international students and immigration. Year on year, we continually bring in international students en masse. They don't leave and then bring their families, and all the housing goes to them. This is not even mentioning standard immigration that occurs every year. We cannot house the people that we have right now. People are angry and something needs to give. That's from Jordan. And that is an interesting point when it comes to analysing the demand for housing year on year.
Yeah, and it is interesting because the Institute of Public Affairs, which is a think tank, released a report this week and estimated that under the Albanese government, we've seen 1.15 million net migrants enter the country in only 27 months. And that's actually 67% more than the previous record, which was under the Rudd-Gillard government. And incredibly, in just 27 months, this government's brought in more net migrants than the entire Hawke-Keating years, which ran for 156 months. So basically, Bill, the Labor's first federal budget in October 2022 estimated that we'd have 470,000 net overseas migration over 2 years. And in its first, instead, we got about 1 million. So that's an extra, roughly 500,000 people that obviously need housing. And that's really the primary driver behind the rental crisis. We've brought in 500,000, roughly, more people than they projected. And as a result, we haven't built, obviously, nearly enough houses for that extra 500,000 people. And then we have a shortage of housing. It's not, none of this is rocket science. And unfortunately, the data that was released this week by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, so they have two sets of immigration data. They've got the quarterly official net overseas migration data, then they have a monthly proxy, which is basically their net permanent long-term arrivals, and it pretty much matches one for one. And that data was released for June, and what it showed is that over the first 6 months of this year, we've had 268,000 net permanent long-term arrivals, and that's up from 247,000 last year, which was a record. And it's up by 90,000 higher than it was in the same period in 2019 before the pandemic hit. So what this tells you is that immigration is still running incredibly hot, even though it has come off a little bit. And every single month this year, we've had more net permanent long-term arrivals than arrived in any month, comparative month in 2019. So despite the fact that immigration is coming down a little bit, it's still running at incredibly high levels. And as a result, that's one of the reasons why the rental crisis is just ongoing, because we continue to grow the population faster than we build houses. And this is into a macroeconomic environment whereby we have high interest rates. We've got builders, have gone bust left, right and centre. The builders competing for labour and materials against big build infrastructure projects by the states. et cetera, et cetera. And obviously building costs have gone up 40%. So we have a situation whereby it's really hard to build houses, but then we're compounding that by bringing in way more people than we should, which is one of the reasons why we have a rental crisis, cost of living crisis, and also stubbornly high inflation.
And it's a broad spectrum of people too. I don't know how much those figures break down, but across the housing market, you've got highly skilled professional migrants too, who have good disposable income, and they're chewing up the middle and high end houses as well as the low cost housing that we so desperately need, the affordable housing, as they say.
Yeah, and it's pretty much just a numbers game. So, an extra 500,000 people, more than they budgeted when their first budget, need to live somewhere. That's the reality of the situation. So often people say, it's got nothing to do with immigration. It does, because obviously 500,000 bodies need somewhere to live. And if you're in an environment whereby it's harder to build houses than it has been for decades because of all these, 40% increase in costs, we've got, higher interest rates than we've had. And also we have less construction workers available because they're building infrastructure projects instead. You're going to struggle because you're just pumping demand at the same time as the supply is choked. And that's effectively the situation Australia's got. And that is the primary reason why we have a rental crisis. And the solution to it is you've got to, those factors that are impacting construction aren't going to change anytime soon. They're structural at the moment. So the only solution is you've got to pare back immigration to a level that's compatible with the nation's ability to build homes and infrastructure. And if you don't do that, we're going to continue to have problems. And I think, unfortunately, the numbers that are coming in are just so far beyond what they should be. And that's the reason why we have this, perennial problem. And it risks making the rental crisis permanent unless they turn this around.
Leith Van Onselen, once again, thank you very much for the Treasury of Common Sense, mate. And Luke will be back next week and you'll be doing it all again with him. Cheers, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Speak to you next time.
I've got a text message here